Okay, we're going to start talking about the office of the governor, or it's called the executive office or the plural executive. And the governor is the head of what's called the plural executive. And I will be talking much more about this. And so I've broken this particular section down into two. In the first part, we're going to cover about what the governor does, what the governor can do, and what his constitutional powers are that were given to him through the Texas Constitution. Specifically, though, we're going to be talking in this particular part one about the qualifications and the ideologies for Texas governors, or how Texas governors, what qualifications do they need to have to become Texas governor, and do they tend to be more liberal or do they tend to be more conservative? And we've covered some of this when we talked about the ideologies in the political parties. We're going to be talking about the terms that they have, the tenure that they have, and the different levels of staff or the different people that help them run that particular office is called the administration. We're going to be talking about what tools that were provided to him through the Constitution, and then the informal tools that he has, and these are like the power to persuade or whatever. So we're going to be talking about those different things. Plus, the governor has responsibility for certain things that he needs to do to run the state of Texas. Okay, in order to be a governor in the state of Texas, there are some formal and some informal qualifications. The formal qualifications are basically that a person has to be at least 30 years of age, an American citizen, a citizen of Texas 5 years prior to the election. And so since it is a statewide office, everybody has to vote him in. The whole state of Texas has to vote him in. And so the informal qualifications, again, may be a little bit even more important in that most of our governors have been WASPs, and WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. They tend to be male. We've only had 2 female governors in the state of Texas, and many of our governors have been lawyers. That's been their profession. Not all of them. The current one that we have, Greg Abbott, is our current governor, and he is a lawyer. Now, when it comes to being elected in the state of Texas, as I said, it's a statewide office. There are some ideologies that come into play. Now, if you are running from the Democratic Party, and the primary candidates tend to be more conservative to moderate. Again, more conservative to moderate. You saw that Texas was a pretty red state. And so in order to be elected, if you are a Democrat, you have to kind of build a coalition of people that are going to be supporting you. And so the people that will most likely be supporting this conservative to moderate Democratic candidate would be people that are in business. And yes, there are some people that are in business that are Democrats. Minorities tend to vote for the Democratic candidate as well. People that are union members and teachers, these are the ones that are more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. Now, when it comes to the Republicans, again, if you're a Republican running for office, it's usually somebody who's going to be, again, more conservative to moderate. Lately, though, there have been more of the Tea Party members that have been elected. But the more conservative to moderate have a better chance of being elected many times in the state of Texas, because what they do is that they gain the support from the more conservative Democrats. And that has happened many times already, but it's changed. In the recent past, it has changed. With the Tea Party coming in the state of Texas, we have had more Tea Party legislators being elected. We have a Tea Party governor that was elected, a Tea Party lieutenant governor that was elected. So this might be saying that Texas is becoming pretty conservative right now. Okay, I mentioned that the governor has to run based on a statewide election. And so his tenure is 4 years. So we elect him for 4 years. And there are no term limitations. And I've talked about term limitations already. And so as long as we are voting somebody in, they can serve. You know, the previous governor, Rick Perry, former governor Rick Perry, ran 3 times. He was elected 3 times. If he had run again, he most likely would have been elected again. Okay, in the event that the governor has to step down for whatever reason, whether it be because of impeachment or whether he cannot finish out his term, such as George W. Bush, who was governor for the state of Texas, became the president in 2000, and so somebody had to step in. And so that person that steps in is the lieutenant governor. That's the line of succession. And so the governor can be impeached just like the president. He's impeached by the House of Representatives. That's what HR stands for, the House of Representatives, by a simple majority, and must be convicted by the Senate by a two-thirds majority. So there is a way to be able to remove the governor if he's not doing a good job. If that's the case, then the lieutenant governor is the one that steps in and becomes the governor. Now, here in the state of Texas, the governor makes $150,000 a year. He gets a governor's mansion there in Austin, and he has an expense account in order to keep up the mansion. And so the expense account includes people to do the maintenance on the mansion, such as like the maintenance people, the cooks, the gardeners, etc., etc. But there's also a professional staff that he has to go ahead and hire in order to help him run this office of the governor, because there are some different programs that he has in his office. And so some of these programs, one of them in particular has really been under fire, especially when we were having the election for the governor this last go round. And that particular one was called the Texas Enterprise Fund. And so the governors that were running, or the candidates who are running for governor, kept saying, well, this is nothing but corporate welfare. This is nothing but corporate welfare. And so they wanted to go ahead, they did an analysis of it, and they said, what this program does, it brings different companies to the state of Texas. And so we will be talking, when I talk about local government, about different packages that local government can use to try to lure businesses into their communities. Well, that's what was happening at the state level, that the governor would go out to different companies throughout the nation and throughout the world and bring these companies to the state of Texas, and in return he would suspend their property taxes. He would cut all these kinds of deals with them. And what the companies would do, they would say, well, we're going to be hiring so many people, we're going to create so many jobs. So when you create jobs, that's just better for the economy, for any economy, but particularly for the Texas economy. So when they did this audit, they said, well, the companies were promising that they were going to be creating 500 jobs, and it really was only like 60 jobs. And so there was no mechanism built in to go back to the company and say, hey, you're not keeping your promise. So when the current governor, Greg Abbott, was elected, he said no, that he was going to reform that particular program. He said, I see that there's a value in it, but not the way that it's set up. So they're currently in the process of revamping that program so it's not considered to be corporate welfare. Okay, the governor's office also has to have a staff, and the staff would be something like the chief of staff, somebody that's going to be able to help him run the office of the governor, to provide advice for something that may be going on in the state of Texas, to provide information that they may need for some kind of program or what's going on in the state of Texas, and just to basically provide assistance for the decision-making process within the office of the governor. And so it is often said that having a good staff is going to be the key ingredients for a successful chief executive. Now, another part of the staff that the governor's office has they're called political appointments. And I'm going to be talking more about political appointments in just a little bit. But the political appointments are basically people that the governor rewards, if you want to call it that, rewards for helping him get into office by appointing them to different boards and commissions. So these boards are more like regulatory boards for the public agencies, and the commissions are basically regulatory commissions for the different public agencies. They may even be people that serve like on the university's board of regents, and I know that they are appointed by the governor. So they're political appointments made by the governor. And so the big deal about being able to appoint people is that They're going to be somebody that follows his ideology. And so when programs are going to be set up in Texas, they're going to be either more conservative or more liberal, depending on the ideology of the current governor. Now, the governor's office also has to have legislative assistants. And so these are people that are saying, okay, we have to keep watching what the legislature is doing. And so we need to let them know if the governor is going to support that particular statute, that law that they're trying to pass, or if the legislators need to go ahead and redesign that particular law. So they're the liaison between the governor and the legislative leadership, and they will function as governor's lobbyists, because what they will try to do is that they will try to persuade these legislators to support the governor's position. Okay, so in order to run this office of the governor, there needs to be somebody that's going to have the administrative skills that are going to be needed to run the office of the governor, because the office of the governor also has other programs that I want to mention, and one of them would be like all of the disaster planning for the state of Texas. That goes through the governor's office. So there's got to be somebody on there that has like emergency management planning, that has like some type of like public administration skills to do the strategic plans, to do the budgeting, to do all of these kinds of things. So these types of administrative skills are needed in order to be able to run that office of the governor. And there's like maybe 4 different programs that are administered through the office. And the reason that I mentioned the emergency planning, the disaster programs, is because way back when I first moved to Corpus Christi, this was back in 1999, there was a hurricane coming, and the hurricane's name was Brett. And so, you know, at that time, I-37 was the only way out of Corpus Christi. And so because it was the only way out of Corpus Christi, you can imagine the traffic jam. I mean, the traffic that was there. You know, I had to wait. I was just starting at the university, and this particular hurricane hit like the weekend before the semester started, and I didn't have any kind of communications. You know, I wasn't on their email, I wasn't on their Code Blue. They didn't even have Code Blue in those days, so I had to wait to find out whether or not the university was going to close. So they said, yes, the university is closed. So I said, okay, good, I'm going to go ahead and evacuate. Well, I live on the south side, and it took me 4 hours to get from like the Everhart SPID exit to like the refineries. And so at that time, the governor was really criticized, because they were saying, well, you know, you should have opened up I-37 to contraflow traffic. But he did not have the authority to do that because of this plural executive. And so consequently, after that, the governor, and at that time it was George W. Bush, at that time the governor said, no, we have to start doing something about it. So he started trying to wrestle some of that power away, to consolidate it into the office of the governor. And when Rick Perry took over after George W. Bush went up to Washington D.C. because he was elected as a governor, then they went ahead and put that program under the governor's office, because they were saying, you know, Texas is so huge and there's so many different communities that somebody has to have those coordination abilities to be able to do that. Okay, so the governor has to be able to persuade, as do his liaisons, his legislative staff. And so these tools of persuasion are used in order to try to influence public policy. And that's just another way of saying to try to shape the way the laws are going to be passed. And so in order to do this, there needs to be somebody on there that's going to be able to bargain, has bargaining ability, to persuade, because it's this tool of persuasion is very important for any executive office. And most importantly, they need to be able to broker between competing interests, because you're going to have people that are on one side of the aisle, people on the other side of the aisle, and I'm talking conservative and liberal. And so the laws don't usually come out real conservative or real liberal in the past. So there needs to be somebody to be able to broker between these interests, and it falls to the office of the governor. And so it really depends on that particular governor's personality and how well he's going to be able to do that. You know, George W. Bush was much more effective in his tools of persuasion, his ability to broker interests, his ability to persuade. He was much more effective at doing that within the state of Texas. Okay, other tools that he has are his formal and his informal powers. So the formal powers, read them as legal powers or his constitutional powers. So these are actual rules that are stated in the laws or in the Constitution. Then there are informal or extra legal powers. They're not stated in the Constitution, but they're derived from the legal powers. So these again are the bargaining, the persuasiveness, and the brokering, which is what I was talking about just a minute ago. So these are formal powers, constitutional powers. What does the Constitution say the governor can do? And I'll go through those in a little bit. And then the informal powers, the extra legal powers, that the governor says, well, I have to use my personality, my ability to persuade in order for these laws to get passed in Texas the way I think that they need to be passed. His agenda, to follow his agenda. So let's talk about the constitutional powers then. So the Constitution of the state of Texas, the one that was passed in 1876, said, now the only thing that the governor can do is he can veto, item veto, or issue a threat of a veto. He can call special sessions of the legislature. He can appoint members to boards and commissions. So let's go through these. Now, when it comes to the veto, when we did the section on the legislature, I told you it goes through all of this song and dance until it gets to the final passage, and then it goes to the governor to decide whether he's going to sign it or veto it or whatever. So let me tell you about the whatever now. He signs the bill, it becomes law. He vetoes the bill, it does not become the law. Okay, but and so if it does not become a law, and if the legislature feels very strongly that they want that particular bill to pass, it can be sent back and they can override that veto by 2/3 vote, just like they can at the congressional level. So the legislature has the ability to override that veto by a 2/3 vote. Now, what is different about the state of Texas is that in Texas we have no veto, no pocket veto, no pocket veto. So in the state of Texas, what that means that if the governor neither signs nor vetoes the bill, it becomes a law anyway. And so this pocket veto would say it would kill the legislation passed at the end of the session by just ignoring that bill. We don't have that. If the governor ignores the bill, it becomes a law anyway. And so you would really never know whether the governor signed it or not unless you go back and you try to track it. You say, well, when did he sign it? Did he sign it? And if there's no date of when the governor signed that piece of legislation, it was one of these. It went through without him signing it. And there might be reasons why he doesn't want to sign it. He will usually attach something saying why he's opposed to it or whatever. But anyway, okay, so that's the veto. Important part, the governor can veto. If he doesn't veto, he doesn't sign it, it becomes law anyway because Texas does not have this pocket veto. Now this thing called an item veto, what that is that a piece of legislation can go through and the governor can say, well, I don't want to go ahead and veto the whole thing, but I don't like this program, I don't like this item, I don't like this project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the money part, the appropriations part. I'm going to leave it standing, but I'm going to take out the money because even though it's on the books as a law, and if there's no money, how are you going to run a program if no money's been appropriated to it? So anyway, it's used as a negative legislative tool, just to take out the money because he doesn't agree with it. Then there's the threat of a veto. And the threat of a veto is basically saying the governor or the legislative aides will go to the legislature or the bureaucrats or the lobbyists, and they will say, this law needs to be shaped this way. I will not support it. I will veto it. And so it's used to kind of persuade the way the legislation, that law is going to be passed. So threat of a veto is an important one for the governor as well as for the president. We've talked about these special sessions before. And so I told you when we talked about the legislature and we talked about it in the Constitution that sometimes special sessions are called, but only the governor is allowed to call these special sessions. So it's an exclusive gubernatorial power. And so it's a governor that decides what the agenda is going to be, what the legislative subject is going to be. And it can only last for 30 days. The governor can call others, but it can only be 30 days at a time. And so a lot of times the legislators or the lobbyists will say, well, if we go ahead and take care of your business, your agenda items, your legislative subjects, can we also consider other things? And it's up to the governor to say yes or no, or whatever he wants to do. But let me give you an example about a special session gone wrong for the governor. And this was under Rick Perry. I don't know if y'all remember this woman named Wendy Davis. She was a legislator. She's not serving anymore. She ran for governor from the Democratic side, but she didn't get it. But anyway, so what happened is that they were considering the latest abortion bill, and they had to call the special session because they kind of ran out of time in the regular 140-day session. And so they had like maybe 3 or 4 different things they were going to take care of. And so they took care of the other 3 things or whatever, and then they waited to do that abortion bill. And this is the one about where they were going to close some of the abortion clinics because they wanted them to be like ambulatory care centers, kind of like a hospital, in case something went wrong or whatever. And so Wendy Davis was very opposed to this particular bill, and what she did is that she filibustered the bill. And she filibustered the bill until it was almost too late to take a vote. Anyway, so David Dewhurst was the lieutenant governor at that time, and so he closed that session. One of the rules, he closed it and he says, we need to take a vote. And so they recorded the vote. But by the time the vote was recorded, it was already after midnight, and the session had already closed, so they lost. So the next day, the governor calls another special session that they were just going to do this one thing. They were just going to handle this abortion bill. And then the lieutenant governor at that time, he suspended the rule on filibustering, and it passed right away. So that's just an example. Okay, some of the formal tools that he has, this executive tools of persuasion. Let me just say this about that. It's shared. It's shared by the plural executive. So the way that the Constitution set it up way back when, they said we don't want one governor to have too much power to try to shape everything only the way that he wants to see it. There has to be some kind of balance there. And so the power is shared with the plural executive. And I want you to notice that the lieutenant governor serves as the president of the Senate, but he also serves in the executive office because he's part of that plural executive. So in a lot of ways, he's much more powerful than the governor. So consequently, the governor is one of the weakest state chief executives in the nation. Okay, so this is the plural executive. So just take a look at this. We're going to be talking about some of these people that are elected that are considered part of the plural executive. And so if you look at it, you see that the lieutenant governor really does have more people under him than the governor. So this is what's called an organizational chart of the plural executive. So as I said, we're going to be talking about some of these offices in just a little bit. Okay, so the tools for the governor themselves, the ones that the Constitution has given to him, the first one would be the power to appoint. We'll talk about that one. The governor as chief of state, the governor as the chief budget officer, and the governor when it comes to clemency for prisoners. So this is the big deal about the power to appoint. There's these independent boards and commissions, and so the governor will say, and in a way that you can say it's almost like a cabinet, like the president has a cabinet, not exclusively, but almost. And so these are going to be people that do not have to be elected into a state office, that they will be appointed by the governor. Let me give you an example. Like I talked about the Secretary of State, the Texas Secretary of State, that has everything to do with elections. Well, this is not an elected position. This is an appointed position. So the governor gets to appoint the person that he wants on there. It would be somebody like the Commissioner for Health and Human Services. That's not an elected position, so the governor appoints somebody on there. So they will make all of the policies, like this last one, the Commissioner for Health and Human Services. They do all the welfare stuff. They do all the health stuff. So the people that he puts in there will most likely follow his ideology when they're making regulatory policy, administrative and regulatory policy. And that just means they're making the rules on how different programs are going to be set up in the state of Texas. An example of this one would be, let's go to the healthcare. And I talked about Obamacare when we talked about federalism, but an example of this would be, like for example, the Medicaid. Obama said under this Obamacare, or that's his program, the major Obamacare, that states can either buy into Medicaid and expand their programs. They can lift the income guidelines so more people can be able to be eligible for Medicaid, or they can make up their own exchanges. They can come up with their own exchanges. So Texas said no, we're not going to do either of those, and so that part of that was the decision of the Commissioner of the Health and Human Services, because they're saying we don't want to expand Medicaid. We don't want for Texas to have to pay more in terms of this match that I talked about when we talked about federalism. Yes, the federal government will give us money, but Texas has to match it. Okay, moving on, sorry. Okay, the other thing that the governor can do is that in order to appoint somebody to one of these commissions, that they have to have like the okay of the senator from that area. So because the senator, it's like the same thing as at the U.S. level. The president will nominate somebody. The Senate is the one that confirms. Well, same thing in Texas. The Senate is going to confirm these appointees. So the governor will go to the senator from that area and say, I'm going to be appointing this guy. Do you have a problem with that? That's senatorial courtesy. And the senator may say, I do have problems with this guy. He has, a weak moral record. He's been involved in some shady deals, ethical problems, whatever. So the senatorial courtesy is that senator has the right to refuse to vote to confirm this particular appointee. The other thing that the governor can do is that in the event that there is a vacancy in one of the state level courts, that the governor can go ahead and appoint somebody to fill that office until the next general election. So the governor can say, yes, there's an opening over here. We know that these judges are going to be elected. We're going to wait until the next election go round. In the meantime, I'm just going to fill somebody in that office. And as we know, if there's somebody that's already in that office, they have a better chance of being elected once they do run for office because they are an incumbent. There are some roles that the governor has to play, and the first one that I want to talk about is the governor as the chief of state. And so there's a lot of pomp and ceremony when it comes to being the governor. And so anytime there's going to be something big going on in the state of Texas, the governor will show up for a photo op if nothing else. But at least this is his ceremonial role because he's considered to be the first citizen of Texas. And so, a lot of times you see him like signing this bill. And again, it's like a photo op saying, I'm the governor. And so what happens is that, the governor wants to go ahead and get his name out there because he said it's going to increase my popularity. It's going to increase my prestige. It's going to broaden my image. And so, I want people to see that I'm an effective leader. So, I'm going to get all of this media attention. And that's just like his role as chief of state in the state of Texas. Something big happens in the state, whether it be something good or something bad. A lot of the disasters that have been happening in the state of Texas, like in Houston and Dallas or whatever, you can see that the governor will do a flyover. We can't really walk around, but he'll do a flyover, and they will be, he'll be pointing down to, yes, I see the flooding or whatever, a photo op. Okay, other things that the governor can do as the chief of state is that he will coordinate relations between Texas and other state governments. So let me explain this for a minute. This thing called extradition, it's also called rendition. But what happens is that if somebody commits a crime here in the state of Texas and then flees, whether they go to like New Mexico or they go to Arizona or they go to Oklahoma or whatever, and that person committed the crime here in Texas or here in Wessex County, that person has to be tried where that felony was committed, because that county will have jurisdiction, and that's where they need to try him. So it's the governor's responsibility to bring the prisoner back, to get that prisoner extradited back to the state of Texas. So the governor's office has to make that request to bring that prisoner back over here. A minute ago, I mentioned all of the flooding that we have had recently. Oh, well, and actually in the past. I mean, you know, like the weather patterns are changing. Dallas floods a lot. Houston floods a lot. We're lucky that we do not flood a lot. Not recently anyway. But anyway, so anytime there's going to be any kind of federal disaster aid requested, the governor is the one that has to declare that particular area, the counties, a disaster area. Once they are declared a disaster area, then the governor can go to FEMA, it's a Federal Emergency Management Agency, and ask them for money to help with the cleanup process. So it is the governor's responsibility to ask for federal aid after he declares a certain area of Texas as a disaster zone, a disaster area. Another role that the governor has is that of the budget. The governor is considered to be the chief budget officer of the state. But it is the legislature that actually does the budget. That is the only law that they actually have to pass every time the legislature meets, is they have to pass a 2-year budget. It's a biennial budget. So it's 1 year at a time, but they pass it for 2 years. And so the governor's proposals are not usually as influential as the legislative budget board, because it is the legislature that has the power of the purse. But again, it's more of that sharing of the powers, that the governor is considered to be the chief budget officer. But again, it is the legislative budget board that's more influential. Then I want to talk about this thing called clemency. And you know, you may not be familiar with this term, but what that one means is that, you know, you see on TV, and a lot of times you see this prisoner that's on death row and he's getting ready to be executed and he's waiting for that phone call from the governor, right? Well, guess what? In Texas, that doesn't happen, and that will never happen. And so what happened is that in 1936, there was a constitutional amendment that took a lot of this power away from the governor and gave it to the Board of Pardons and Parole. And so it curtailed the governor's powers, and so it makes clemency, the Board of Pardons and Paroles makes clemency recommendations to the governor. Now the governor exercises his clemency abilities by recommending less clemency but not more. And guess what? The only thing the governor can really do is postpone an execution of a death penalty for 30 days, and it's usually only because some other evidence has surfaced and they need to go ahead and they need to take a look at it, you know. But by the time, in the state of Texas, by the time a person reaches the point where they're going to be executed, it's gone through several appeals processes already that we'll talk about when we talk about the court system. But I also have to tell you that it's only been in the recent past, now it's maybe the last 10 years or so, that Texas has actually been using the forensic evidence, the DNA evidence, and many people have been cleared and have been taken off of death row.